Hello, scholars. Welcome back to another thrilling history lesson. I'm Mr. Denny. This is my U.S. History e-learning classroom. Today, we're going to be talking about the War on Terror, primarily the 9/11 attacks, September 11th terrorist attacks, and then the aftermath, the effects of that attack, which are just as, if not more important. Remember, you've got your Google Doc lecture notes, right? I've got mine over here that I'll be looking at. Make a copy, print them out. Maybe you're just typing, maybe you're just handwriting, whatever is your note-taking preference. All right, let's get started with this lecture. So we're talking the War on Terror. At the end of this lecture, the goal here is to be able to explain the political and social impact of the September 11th terrorist attack. So you probably already know something about the September 11th attacks. You've probably heard of it before just because of, how pop culture works. I was alive. I was like 10, maybe 10, 11 when it happened. So this is somewhat recent history, but it's made a huge impact on today, society, politics, really kind of everything, right? This is a big event. So let's go back to the beginning then and figure out where this all comes from. So we start with Al-Qaeda, and the beginnings of Al-Qaeda begin with a guy named Osama bin Laden. So Osama bin Laden comes from a wealthy kind of construction family in Afghanistan. He joins the military in Afghanistan, and he becomes kind of radicalized. He becomes very extreme when it comes to his religious beliefs in Islam. And based on his military experience and combined with kind of his own interpretation of this religion, he begins to view the United States as the primary enemy in the world. A big motivation in that is the United States' involvement in the Gulf War during the 90s. In 1990, the United States invaded the Middle East to try and stop a guy named Saddam Hussein. And so he views that invasion by the United States in 1990 as like a big example of why the United States needs to be stopped. That the United States tries to get involved, in all other countries and all other wars and in everyone's business, and that they're spreading their, secular ideas, that they're spreading their ideas about democracy and freedom and, non-religious ideas, right? They're spreading non-religious ideas. And to Osama bin Laden, everything would be best handled if it was under strict Islamic law, right? So Osama bin Laden believes the complete restoration of Islamic law, that's the only way to set things right. And therefore, the United States is the primary enemy to his goal in trying to do that. So Osama bin Laden forms this kind of terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. It's a multinational, multi-country organization recruiting other terrorist groups from other countries, recruiting individuals from other countries, anyone who shares his belief that Islamic law should be the kind of one ruling factor he wants in his group, in Al-Qaeda, right? So Osama bin Laden forms Al-Qaeda, right? And so Al-Qaeda had actually been doing multiple terrorist attacks, bombings, throughout the 90s, right? And there's one in 1998 where they bombed the U.S. Embassy in Africa that kind of really motivates him to begin planning an attack directly on the United States. So Osama bin Laden, he provides leadership, he provides funding, and he, above all, starts recruiting people to help him in this attack. And he's specifically looking for people who speak English, who will be able to blend into Western culture well. He knows these are people who are going to have to lie low in the United States for a while. And he's also looking for people with flight experience, right? So he has this plan of using planes to attack the United States somewhere, right? And there was also like a lot of conversations about what specific targets they should attack. Most of the hijackers come from Saudi Arabia. Some are from United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, Egypt, but most of the hijackers are from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia actually provides, family connections do really in Saudi Arabia. provide the funding and the connections for many of them to get passports to come to the United States in the first place. So from 1999 to 2001, they recruited men to take flying lessons in the United States to kind of start the planning process here in the U.S., right? So that's happening from 99 to 2001. Now, what did the United States know while this is all going on? Well, Osama bin Laden was on the top 10 most wanted terrorist list, right? Like, they knew Osama bin Laden was a person, they knew Al-Qaeda was a thing, right? And they also, both the CIA and the FBI, each received different little pieces of information about some kind of attack, right? They didn't know the specifics, but they knew that something big was supposed to happen, some kind of attack. They knew that meetings were taking place. One organization would hear that there were like suspicious people who were requesting flight lessons and time in a flight simulator. But the agencies did not share this information with each other. And that failure for these organizations to easily exchange information without feeling like they were, disclosing top secret or confidential information, that failure to share that information was ultimately pointed to later down the line as kind of a big reason why this terrorist attack was as severe and extreme as it was. So the U.S. had some idea, but they didn't know the specifics. And maybe if they did, they could have done something. We're not quite sure, right? But there was some knowledge here that something might happen. And they definitely knew who Osama bin Laden was. How do I change? There we go. So let's cut to September 11th, 2001. Now, September 11th is chosen as a date because in 1683, there was an Islamic war where Poland won, and it was symbolic because that was when the West started dominating Islamic culture. And so Osama bin Laden was like, we're going to choose September 11th so that now it's going to be the other way around and Islam is dominating Western culture, right? So there's some thought put into September 11th as a date. So in the end, they end up recruiting 19 hijackers, and they scatter them amongst 4 different flights. These flights are chosen for their size and their long distance routes, right? They want big planes with lots of gasoline, right, for maximum damage. Flight 11 and Flight 175, these each strike a tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. and then at 9:03 a.m. Now, I remember watching this on TV as it was happening. When that first plane struck the World Trade Center towers, and we'll take a look at a clip real quick. But when it struck that tower, people thought it was an accident. People thought it was just a very terrible accident of a plane hitting a skyscraper. When that second plane hit, that kind of triggered in people's minds that this is an intentional act that is happening. So then at 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 strikes the Pentagon, and then Flight 93. Now, this is a 4th plane that was hijacked. It was intended for the United States Capitol. Some people think it might have been trying to hit the White House, but later confirmed the U.S. Capitol, right, where Congress meets. Now, the passengers, by this point, were able to hear about what was going on, about the other flights that had been hijacked. They were able to fight back, and ultimately the plane ends up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania. Remember, it was headed for Washington, D.C., but it ends up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania, and you can see the turnaround here. It crashes in this field, kind of averting a major disaster of this striking Washington, D.C. There's a pretty great movie made about this called Flight 93. So let's take a look real quick at the planes striking the towers. I'll put this clip in the links so that you can take a look at it on your own. But let's just take a look real quick. So the first plane has already struck, and then we're going to see kind of live on the news the second plane hitting the towers. So let's take a look.
Inside. The only thing that came out was a little bit of the outside awning, but I'd say the hole is. Let me just get a better look right now.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd say the hole takes about. Looks like 6-7 floors were taken out, and there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Hold on just a moment. We got an explosion inside.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
Okay.
Hold on, I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
Okay, the whole building just exploded some more. The whole top part
Okay.
Building's still intact. People are running up the streets.
So we'll pause right there, right? So this is happening live on television. Terrifying, lots of confusion. And nobody's really sure yet what's going on, right? Who's behind this? What's happening? How much more is going to happen? So these planes hit these towers, the Pentagon, crashing into a field, right? The destruction ends up causing the deaths of nearly 3,000 people, injuring more than 6,000, right? In the surrounding area, the debris, the ash, the smoke, right? That causes health problems. And this is the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. Now, what made the attacks in the buildings even more deadly was the fact that only one stairwell remained open during this whole time, right? So people trying to escape, it's basically one stairwell in only one of the buildings. And so that makes this attack even more deadly. And then to build on that, within an hour of the initial impact, all that heat, all that smoke causes the buildings to collapse, increasing the death count, right? So the buildings collapse, making it even more deadly. In kind of a show of solidarity, of community, we saw police and rescue workers from around the country traveling to New York City just because the need was so high. And then, of course, immediately when this happens, within, 30 minutes, all domestic flights immediately grounded, right? We cannot have planes in the air. There was an order put out by the vice president at this time, Dick Cheney, that any plane that was suspected to have been hijacked, to shoot it down immediately. No planes had to be shot down. But, that order was out there. And then, of course, international flights. Sorry, guys, you got to go back, right? Like, we are dealing with something right now. Now let's think about the after effects here, right? We have this kind of tragic event. How does that shape American politics? How does that shape society? How does society respond? So let's go. Here we go. So, first major thing, huge impact here. Legal aftermath is the Patriot Act, right? Full name is like the USA Patriot Act. Full name is like this giant 30-word acronym. But essentially what the Patriot Act does is it expands the government's ability to investigate suspected terrorists. And that sounds solid, right? Why wouldn't the government need to have this ability? Well, think about it. Government's ability to investigate. Here's what the word investigate kind of carries with that. They can force companies to hand over phone records, email records, financial records. They can search library, checkout records, right? Maybe you're reading books that have to do with terrorism, that have to do with building a bomb. They can essentially wiretap, right? Like listen to the phone calls of anyone pretty much anywhere, anytime, right? There's some rules, but the rules are secret. There's these kind of like private courts that are specifically made for this so that they can fast track those kinds of wiretaps. And remember, we're dealing with national security, right? That's the logic behind this. And suspected terrorists, right? Who is a terrorist? Well, it's anyone who may cause or contribute to a terrorist act, right? Very broad, and that encapsulates a lot of people, right? People who are immigrants, people who even are citizens, right? People who are citizens but in other countries, right? Very broad net that they're casting. Why is it so broad, right? Why is the government suddenly gaining all of these powers, all of these abilities to investigate suspected terrorists? Well, this is past 1 month after the attacks, right? Like the nation is still trying to deal with these attacks, and you put forward this bill that says, hey, if we have these powers, we might be able to prevent something like this. People are going to vote for it without a doubt, right? So this is passed just 1 month after the attacks. All of these abilities, all of these powers for the government, they seem like a good idea. Also created as part of this was the Department of Homeland Security, right? We have a brand new government agency designed to protect and prevent any kind of future domestic emergencies, domestic terrorism specifically. And maybe the most visible change here is the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, right? If you've ever been to an airport, if you've flown, you have been affected by some element of the September 11th attacks. Before this, there was no TSA, right? Airport security was basically like up to the airports. They would hire a private company. Like there were some regulations. But here we see airport security just ramped up hugely, right? Like take your shoes off. you have to get into this like super high-tech x-ray machine, right? So the TSA, huge kind of legal effect that we see very visibly if you ever go to an airport, if you ever fly. So legal aftermath, right? Social aftermath. How does society change here? Well, one of the most visible kind of immediate ways that we saw society change was numerous incidents of harassment and hate crimes against Muslims, South Asians, anyone who seemed like they were Muslim, right? Or seemed like they could be from the Middle East, or seemed, maybe even just like seemed foreign, right? In fact, we saw the number of incidents of harassment and hate crimes. We saw what normally would be reported in a 6-month span. We saw that amount reported within 1 week after the attacks, right? There were attacks on mosques, right, which are kind of Islamic kind of places of worship. We saw assaults on people who seemed Muslim. There was even a murder just 4 days after the attacks, right? Someone was shot and killed in Arizona because of how they looked, because of what they believed, right? In response, Islamic organizations, they launched blood drives, donations, provide medical assistance, food, shelter for victims, right? To kind of make this showing that this harassment and these hate crimes that are being committed, like, these are not justifiable in any way. The Islamic community is with you. The Islamic community has nothing to do with this small group of extremists that decided to do this terrible act of terrorism, right? So that's the social aspects, right? That's one big change we saw how society changed. And then kind of politically, or kind of like in the world sense, the United States begins its war on terror, right? And terror, by the way, underlined in red here, that's going to be our secret word, terror, Terror. So war on terror begins. What does that mean, right? Kind of vague. September 14th, 3 days, right, math, right, 3 days after September 11th, Congress grants the president, in this case it's going to be President Bush, remember, the election of 2000, right, that close election, President Bush gains the authority from Congress. They pass a law and they say the president can do whatever is needed to go after whoever is involved in the 9/11 attacks, right, and this is still in effect today. So that power of the president to basically do whatever he has to do, that ends up being the war on terror. And war on terror is kind of vague, and President Bush tried to narrow it down by saying he's going to identify and defeat terrorists, end countries supporting terrorism, reduce conditions that lead to terrorism, and protect U.S. citizens at home and abroad. Those are really, really big goals, right? And this war is a little bit different because, like, World War II, we knew who the enemies were. It was Hitler, it was Emperor Hirohito in Japan, it was Mussolini, right? War on terror, who's the bad guy, right? It's Osama bin Laden, but President Bush says here, terrorists, terrorism. This concept is the enemy, right? And that makes this a very difficult war. Two big invasions that happen as a part of this war. One, 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, right? We, through military intelligence, through CIA intelligence, FBI, we knew that Osama bin Laden was likely somewhere in Afghanistan or somewhere nearby. This results in the longest war in U.S. history. 2,400 U.S. deaths. As of now, 76,000 or so terrorist deaths. At this point, terrorist includes members of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, which is like a government that the Al-Qaeda set up, as well as the organization ISIS, which is going to crop up a couple years after the beginning here, right? We also see 38,000 civilian deaths, right? And this is kind of what makes the invasion of Afghanistan controversial. One of the reasons is the number of people who are not involved in the military who end up losing their lives as a result of this invasion. 2003, we also see the invasion of Iraq as part of a war on terror. Now, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, no connections to 9/11, but he gets lumped in here because Saddam Hussein was seen as a dictator. He was seen as someone who was acting like a terrorist, therefore, war on terror. He's acting like a terrorist. He might support future terrorists. We're going to go after him as well. We also accused him of having weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. In the end, none found. So the invasion of Iraq ends with us taking out Saddam Hussein. It ends in 2011, but one of the effects of that invasion is the formation of a terrorist group you might have heard in the news somewhat recently, maybe, is ISIS, right? You've heard of ISIS, maybe, right? ISIS came around because of that 2003 invasion of Iraq. We created so much instability there that it kind of gave rise to the conditions for a new terrorist group, right? ISIS. And you might remember, most of the hijackers, some of the funding for those hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. No military action against Saudi Arabia, right? And this is one of the reasons this remains a controversial war in general. Just like even today, people aren't sure whether this is justified or not. So in conclusion, what do we have? Well, where do I put my little guy? There we go. 2011, Osama bin Laden captured in Pakistan, right? We tracked him down. He had been moving from Afghanistan to Pakistan, different supporters housing him. Finally, under President Obama, Osama bin Laden is captured and killed. The 9/11 memorial in that same year opens in 2011, right? That former site of the World Trade Center towers, that is now a memorial and museum. Museum might not be open right now, but the memorial, you certainly could take a long road trip maybe. And the war in Afghanistan is still ongoing. We still have U.S. troops in Afghanistan, right? This is the longest war in U.S. history. And it's increasingly, one of the issues with that is it's increasingly becoming a drone war. The United States is using military kind of robotic drones instead of physical troops, which one, saves soldiers, but on the other hand, we're seeing a growing number of civilian deaths, actually increasing under President Obama. And this continues to be an issue not only with the war in Afghanistan, not only with the war on terror, but with the concept of war in general. And so with this, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to defeat terrorism? What is the cost of freedom? How do you know that you've defeated a concept? How do you know you've won a war that isn't specifically based against one aggressor, right? Osama bin Laden captured and killed in 2011, but it's 2020 now, and the war in Afghanistan continues. So what does victory look like? We have to ask ourselves that. The answer, though, is for another future lecture. All right, nice work. Hopefully that didn't go by too fast, or maybe it went by faster than you had hoped. I don't know which one. All right, see ya. Have a good day.